Welcome to Psych Sessions Mentoring. In these episodes, Kenzie Peterson and Mona Shu chat with their guests about all things mentoring in higher education. So thanks for tuning in and welcome to Psych Sessions Mentoring.
Hi, this is Mona Shu.
And I'm Kenzie Peterson. And this is a special Psych Session series on mentoring.
Our guest today is Dr. Sarai Blincoe, who is an associate professor and chair in the Department of Psychology at Longwood University. Dr. Blincoe joined the Longwood faculty in 2012 after earning her PhD in experimental psychology from the University of Kentucky. Dr. Blincoe has many years of mentoring experience, including with the Society for the Teaching of Psychology. As the disciplinary-based educational researcher for a multi-year NSF S-STEM grant, she conducted research on the strategies that STEM faculty mentors use to support undergraduate STEM mentees. Recently, she served on a panel on mentoring experiences for STP at the APA convention and led a workshop on mentoring at STP's annual conference on teaching. Welcome to Psych Sessions in our series on mentoring, Sarah.
Thank you for inviting me.
Well, Sarah, we'll go ahead and just get right into it. What is mentoring, or what is a mentor to you?
Me, a mentor is someone who is committed to the personal or professional development of who they're working with. And a mentor, we often use words like coach or advisor or even a counselor to kind of capture those relationships. And what gets tricky is that one person's kind of definition of mentoring could be pretty distinct from someone else's. And so as I've been working on this from more of a kind of psychological research perspective, I've learned a lot about all the dimensions to consider when you're trying to capture what you mean by mentoring. Like, what's your purpose? How intense is the mentoring relationship? How did you pick your mentor in the first place? Or were you sort of purposely matched? And even is it someone who's compensated to serve in that role? Because all those things can change the dynamic of serving as a mentor. But ultimately, that person is committed to providing support.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's so many different factors that go into it and that can influence that relationship.
I'm curious, Sarah, you mentioned a few different types of roles, including being a coach or a counselor. Do you have a way of kind of conceptualizing mentoring that kind of delineates, like at what point does it become coaching versus mentoring, or is there a huge overlap?
There's probably more overlap than there are distinctives in these roles. But going back to some of those dimensions, a counselor, for instance, is going to be compensated to provide that socio-emotional support for you, as opposed to maybe someone who is mentoring, whether it was a voluntary connection and was it initiated by the person being mentored or the mentor themselves changes it. And so I think within like a university or college environment, the way we tend to think about mentors are the people who are going to provide especially that kind of academic and career-oriented support, and socio-emotional support might come along with that. But my experience in working with faculty who are trying to mentor students is that that socio-emotional role might be one that they don't feel quite as comfortable with. And so trying to navigate what is the purpose of this mentoring relationship, as opposed to when you get into a counseling relationship, you know that socio-emotional support is going to be kind of a key aspect of what's coming. And then, things like how many people are being mentored by a single person could also change that definition a little bit. But as I've tried to learn more about mentoring to improve my own mentoring and to help my colleagues, and as part of the research that you mentioned I'm doing with mentoring, I've actually found turning towards the literature on professional coaching, for instance, or counseling has been really valuable for understanding mentoring and how we can kind of do better at that in higher education.
That's really great. So speaking about your mentoring and what you're learning and how you're applying it, how would you describe your mentoring style?
So one thing that I struggled with initially, and not just as a mentor, but in kind of my professional role as a faculty member, was maybe overemphasizing competence. And I think this is a struggle for many young women who enter the faculty role, is that you might feel the need to be clear to students who might not be that much younger than you, or to your faculty colleagues who might be much older than you, that you know what you are talking about. And so in my mentoring relationships, which really started out in more of a research-oriented capacity, so mentoring students through the research, I was tending to focus on what they needed to learn from me. And it took some time for me to develop my abilities to support them in other aspects as a mentor and to provide more of that socio-emotional support, because I was concerned about boundaries with students, about how I wasn't supposed to be their friend. And so that's where that kind of dynamic between warmth and confidence is something that's kind of just changed as I've learned more about being a mentor. And I've also been fortunate to see different ways of mentoring role modeled as a graduate student. I essentially had two kind of primary mentors. My primary mentor was kind of on her way out of higher education. She was kind of leaving early. And so I was her last student. I knew I was her last student. And her mentorship was very open, very free, explore whatever you want. She didn't have incentives to publish anymore. But I was also working in a research capacity with a brand new faculty member who was working to get grants, who had a lab that she wanted to build up. And so I got to see different ways of guiding someone professionally from those two women. And that was something I appreciated in the moment, but appreciated even more later, about how each of them chose to navigate, again, that instrumental versus socio-emotional piece, and also the degree to which they chose or didn't choose to include more of a personal dimension. One of them, we spent time together outside of sort of the university setting, and the other, I maybe met family members one time, in 5 years of being a graduate student. And so seeing their different ways of navigating boundaries and providing support was really useful for me. But I still had to figure out my own way. And I think, as other guests have talked about in these sessions, you don't really get explicit training about mentorship. No one sits down and says, well, read these 3 journal articles and then we'll have a discussion and practice it in this way. And so it really is kind of some trial and error and learning from your own observations of mentoring.
I really appreciate that perspective and how much of a process it is. And I appreciate you talking about it as a trial and error, because I think many of us want to do it right and we're worried about making mistakes. And so it can be a little frustrating not having this, like, here's the go-to, everyone should just do this, but recognizing that you really have to adapt. And I really appreciate thinking about it in terms of, what else you have going on, where you are in your career, your own personal style. And it sounds like you were exposed to a couple of different types of styles. And even if they were different, they can both be effective, right? So it's not necessarily one way is always the best way.
I'll say that from afar, I was also able to see as many of us do in graduate school, how other labs were running, how other mentors were supporting their graduate students, because of course, graduate students talk to each other. So you learn about what they like or don't like about their experiences. And so also being able to see what happened when a mentor maybe overlooked the other aspects of a student beyond their work in the lab and wasn't providing support for them as that kind of whole person. And so that was kind of always very much on my mind and really shaped how I knew I wanted to approach working with undergraduates. The institution I'm at is only undergraduates within the Department of Psychology. We have a handful of master's programs, but not in this department. And thinking about how it was going to look when I was working with undergraduates as opposed to graduate students, and to be reminded that if I was mentoring them in research, their goal was not going to be to publish a lot or to go out and kind of make a name. And so how do those different goals, my need to understand their goals in kind of entering this mentoring relationship was so important for providing the right kind of support. And again, something you have to learn, because when you move from graduate school research-oriented life into the role of a faculty member at a teaching institution, a lot of things have to shift in your approach and your mindset.
And Sarah, I think you have basically answered our next question of what or who has influenced your mentoring style and how you've developed that style. So I think I want to ask you something a little bit different. And I want to kind of get some advice from you about, I guess, kind of your experience as a kind of like an early faculty member and how you've developed your mentoring style in that capacity? Because I could see that being a huge struggle, because you were talking about the need to have competence, but also kind of balance that with warmth. And that's a struggle that I could see myself facing as I navigate my career. So I was wondering if you had any helpful tips for that.
So part of that was changing as my roles within the department changed. And as I became less pinned to things like student evaluations, getting tenure changes, some of those mentoring dynamics. So in some ways, the answer to what kind of experiences taught me about the mentoring process or influenced it, some of that was just the dynamics of the larger institution. And as those incentive structures change, they actually allow your mentoring approach to change. It also happened as I started to shift into roles where my mentorship was more involving other faculty and not necessarily just students, because then you are handling different kinds of challenges and offering different kinds of advice. So those dynamics that we sometimes overlook, almost like those environmental constraints or circumstances, was an important part. I also learned a lot from thinking about therapy. And I decided very early on, like as an undergraduate, that counseling psychology, clinical psychology was not going to be the angle that I pursued. I never even took like a psychopathology class my entire educational career. And so I hadn't thought much about what maybe clinical psychology could bring to the mentoring relationship. But as I started to conduct research on mentoring and was reading about therapeutic techniques, I even ended up taking a class in our graduate program in counseling on therapeutic techniques and started to think differently about mentoring, even to things like, how is my office set up? Do I have chairs positioned in a way that the student I'm talking to has to look like right at me all the time? Or if they're not looking at me, they have to basically look at the floor, which maybe could be construed as rude, versus what you're suggested as a counselor is like angle the chairs so that people can naturally look away to somewhere else in the room. Like, do you have tissues where you have to hand them to the person and sort of basically say to them, it looks like you're about to burst into tears, versus letting them reach for them themselves? And that kind of development through some of the other professional experiences and through changes in my work roles was really important for me, thinking again and again about mentoring and what it would look like. And just like we're supposed to kind of revisit our teaching philosophies, I had the chance to kind of revisit my mentoring approach and to think about how I might actually articulate it. Because we often don't sit down and write that out and think to ourselves, what approach am I taking with mentoring and with advising, which we do a lot of, especially in our undergraduate kind of roles of advising students.
Thank you for bringing up the clinical psychology aspect, because I think I can relate to that, where it's like, oh, I knew I didn't want to go into clinical. And so that's very far removed from like my identity. But there's so much value in incorporating a lot of clinical psychology aspects and techniques into our mentoring.
And something you alluded to earlier is that sometimes people are a little bit more hesitant on the socio-emotional side of things, because for many of us who are not trained as clinicians, we don't necessarily know, like, oh, what do I do when someone starts crying? And so those are great, really concrete things to think about. Just the placement of tissues in your office or chairs. Now I'm kind of looking around in my office going, is this right? But that's such a good tip for those of us who may never really think about reading the clinical literature because it's not, maybe related to our research, but it can be very informative to our mentoring and teaching and advising. So that's really helpful. Thank you.
Really, the number one question that I get, so in this role that I've had as part of a grant at our university and studying mentoring, was to meet regularly with the faculty members who are mentoring STEM students and to support them in their mentoring efforts. So kind of that meta mentoring almost. And continually, the struggles they brought up were in kind of two broad categories. One is, how far do I get into supporting a student socio-emotionally? What are the limits for me versus referring them to your counseling services on or off campus? And, really just not feeling equipped to have those discussions. So knowing that's an area for professional development. And then this other category, which I think resonates with faculty in general, even outside of mentoring in our teaching roles, is I feel like I'm saying these same sort of things to the students over and over again, but the change doesn't happen. They're coming back with the same difficulty. I thought we'd solve this problem. And hearing that actually reminded me of something I picked up very early on in my marriage. One of the most helpful pieces of relationship advice was to make sure to identify, often very explicitly, whether the goal of the conversation you're having is feelings or fix it. And so sometimes I'll need to sit down with someone and say, okay, is this a feelings conversation or a fix it conversation? Because as faculty, we are ready to offer advice, to teach, and sometimes struggle when a conversation isn't about fixing the problem. And so when we get frustrated with students who seem to not be responding to our very well-meaning advice, is it because they weren't looking for advice in the first place? They're processing a problem. They're at the feeling stage. So I've been, in my research, really focused on looking at how faculty use questions in their mentoring. So do they ask questions? Do they ask close-ended or open-ended questions? Who's doing the talking in these mentoring meetings? And it's been incredibly revealing to see, for one, the variability across mentors in their willingness or inclination to ask questions, but that on average, we don't ask very many. And we basically assume that with a question or two, we've kind of figured out the problem, and then provide advice and don't necessarily check in to see if that's where the student was going. And since you have those hierarchical relationships, so often a student might not push back against that advice. So again, the opportunity I've had to really study mentoring and the dynamics of mentoring have opened my eyes to my own mentoring approach. And now in the role of department chair, I have a lot of conversations with students as well as faculty who are navigating difficulties. And so I can really think about questions, and that as a tool, which again connects with that counseling literature and how do counselors use questions in an effective way.
That's really, really thought-provoking. I've been just, as you're talking, I'm like, oh, these are all great things that I don't think I've ever heard articulated in this way. And I have a relationships background, so I really appreciate that explicit ask of feelings or fix it. And you're right in how important that can be, because not only can it be harmful if there's a mismatch in what the student wants and what we're trying to do, but actually it can kind of backfire if, maybe the student just wants to be heard and we are just going in trying to fix it, and it can really come off like we're trivializing it. And so asking questions in the context of the question itself could be doing the thing, right? It's not necessarily even, okay, what did they say? I'm going to do something with that. But it might be just having more questions that are open-ended and giving students or teachers, whoever you're mentoring, a chance to express themselves and feel validated and heard can be a really strong part of that. I really appreciate that. You talked a little bit about research, including the S-STEM grant. This next question can be in the context of that as well, given the S-STEM grant is probably related to diversity, equity, and inclusion. But I'm curious about how DEI has shown up or not in your mentoring experiences. So whether as a mentor, someone being mentored, or in the context of working on something like that grant.
Yes, Longwood University is a predominantly white institution. So one thing that this S-STEM grant is designed to do is to encourage the pursuit of STEM by rural and Pell eligible first generation and students of color. And so encouraging, their entry and their persistence, the ability of the university to retain these students within the STEM majors. So one of the big questions that we ran into as we were designing the program, because the grant essentially supports scholarships for those students, as well as providing those faculty mentors and kind of other support structures throughout their time at Longwood, is what do we do about matching students when we do not have enough faculty of color to pair every student of color? And we know that those pairings of identity can be really valuable. So it took, us looking really closely at the literature to see what are some of the pros and cons. And one thing that I think I've learned to do when I'm working with students where their identities are one that I can't share and I can't, legitimately say I understand a particular life experience, is to remember that they probably have mentors from their community of origin, and that we can do a better job of honoring those communities and the strengths and the connections that they bring from them. And so within mentorship, I try more and more to ask about those people. When I'm just meeting a student for the first time, I like to do this exercise called What Am I Bringing With Me? And you kind of go through a couple key areas of their life experience, like academic, social, even financial, and say, tell me about a time where you experienced a challenge in this area and what you did to kind of cope with or overcome that challenge. So you're asking them to think actively about resilience and about their strengths, their abilities, but it gives me a chance to understand, again, that network of mentors and what mentorships have been valuable for them in the past, so that I can, recognize the limits of what my mentorship could do, or if we're trying to help them find another mentorship on our campus, we can again think of it as a community, a network of mentors. Another aspect that's occurred to me more recently is that, my family, my children, is one by birth and one by adoption, and cross-racial adoption. And so there's a lot of questions for us to consider about providing role models. As I think about, right now, my son is only 3. And so he's not, necessarily, he's not even asking questions about skin color and race and things like that yet. But when that time comes, thinking about the role models that I want my son to have gives me a way to think about my students from another perspective, and to say, as I imagine my son going off to college and trying to find those connections and resources, therefore, what can I create for the students who are coming to my campus, who could be my son someday, could be one of them. So personalizing that has been really important and encouraged me to keep reading and learning about these challenges. There are just so many great resources out there, especially if we look kind of beyond our traditional sources of information as psychology faculty. We can default to searching through the psychology literature or something like that. But there's, national organizations of advisors who have just wonderful, rich resources. And you can read about different advising strategies and ways to mentor and support students who are first generation or students of color or Pell eligible. And so I've really appreciated that. And again, a lot of that was sparked by both, my personal experience as a mother, but also working on this grant and seeing those things kind of come together to help more and more students be successful at a PWI.
That's so fantastic, and something I don't think I've thought about enough in terms of that network and community of mentors. So I'm trying to even think about the students that I'm currently mentoring, like, have we had an explicit conversation about who else might be in that network for them, and how might we work together as a community? Do you have any suggestions on how best to ask those questions so it's not intrusive? Because I think absolutely you're right. You want to honor the communities folks are coming from, but I don't know, there's a potential risk there, I think, of being too inquisitive, or maybe especially surrounding identities that students may not want to talk about too much.
I mentioned that, what am I bringing with me? Set of questions. I think it's about framing why you're asking these things, why you want to hear these stories, that, my role is to provide support. And, when the student is willing to share a little bit more about how they felt supported in the past, that helps me to do a better job. So trying to increase that trust, that's kind of the framework from which to get these things. And because those questions can be open and broad, welcome to the university. We're excited to support you in your educational journey, and would love to know a little bit about, those people in your community or from home who are maybe going to have a hard time seeing you go and say goodbye, and tell us a little bit about those people. Or in school, was there ever a teacher there who just made a really powerful connection for you? Because then maybe we can talk a little bit about how those connections look a little bit different in the faculty relationship, because a lot of students navigate the difference between what high school teachers look like and what university professors look like. And so trying to frame it in a very open way, allowing students to share to the extent they feel comfortable. And in some ways don't have to reveal any identities at all if they don't want, but they tend to like to tell those stories of support. I don't know that I've ran into. Usually it's more of, more information I can work with than maybe too little, but always from that point of the goal here is trust and trying to gather information in order to provide support and not to just kind of dig in. This isn't for selfish curiosity that I'm trying to ask these things. Yeah, and it's important to be explicit about those motivations.
Wow, Sarah, this conversation has been so insightful, and you've provided us with so many amazing resources and advice. And I absolutely can see why we wanted to have you on the podcast as an esteemed mentor, because I really enjoy learning all of this information and all of your techniques. But just kind of as a catch-all, even though you have provided us with tons of information already, is there any other advice that you have for people who are on their mentoring journey? Or even we can go as broad as if you have any advice for institutions or organizations who want to promote and support mentoring relationships.
Definitely need to learn more about mentoring in a research capacity. So I hope more and more people will feel encouraged to study mentoring. We tend to know about it through kind of after the fact stories of, well, here's a mentoring relationship that went well. And so that's kind of why we know that mentoring is a good thing. And more universities are trying to set up programs to have formal mentoring because they know it's good. But we actually don't know a lot about what good mentors do. What are the within kind of situation dynamics that sustain a healthy mentoring relationship? So I hope there'll be more kind of research into that topic. But I think one of my biggest pieces of advice is to look across disciplines and across professions to learn about mentoring. Because if we lock in too much to the title of mentor and try to just look at that, you might only come across of, well, how do you be a good graduate student research mentor? You'll find tons of that. But if you look at some of those other professions, like the executive coaching, we might be a little uncertain about what that profession looks like and maybe even be skeptical of what's happening there. But they're doing research too, and there's a lot out there to learn. And same with advising. The professional people are training to be advisors to help students solve a lot of kind of problems. And they have theories and philosophies advising that are really useful to know. So bringing together all that kind of set of knowledge and techniques, you invest in it just like you invest in learning about different teaching pedagogies. You need to learn about mentoring and not just trust that it's an intuitive thing, because it isn't something that you're necessarily just good at because you're a person or because you're a teacher. In fact, being a faculty member, I think, can sometimes make you struggle with good mentoring because you're very used to that dimension of delivering the information and kind of a strict hierarchy, and it's not always what mentoring looks like.
This is so inspiring. I am just getting so many ideas about things I need to really check into. And then also really awesome places to look for mentoring research that in areas that I would normally not go to first. Thank you so much for that nudge. As we close out, the thing we always ask all of our guests is about self-care, since we think that's really important. And so, Sarah, what is your favorite form of self-care?
I love after dinner family walks. That's what we call them. Since we don't get to do as much of that in the winter time, another one for me is baking. I really enjoy baking. Scones are one of my specialty. And lately I've been mastering a lot of recipes that use gluten alternatives, gluten-free recipes. And so, those things, but really just walking in my community. I'm so privileged to live like a 6-minute walk from my office door and few minutes from our downtown stretch. And even something I didn't, talk about much today, but going back to the idea of a student as a whole, we live just a few minutes walk from my church. And so I go there when they have adoration, and making sure that all those parts of me, the kind of social community part and the work part and the church part, are all like knit together in this really physical way through walking and the way my community kind of exists. That's kind of makes it so that my daily kind of routines can be a part of self-care.
That sounds so lovely. And as a walker myself, I also am lucky enough to live close to my office. I can really resonate with that. It does make a difference being able to just feel that you're shifting from one space to the other and there's this connected thread. Thank you so much, Sarah, for giving us so many things to think about and sharing your wisdom and your expertise in this area. And thank you to our listeners. And stay tuned for more episodes in this series.